Russia supposedly began to meddle way back in 2014, tweeting, quote, Obama was president up to and beyond the 2016 election, so why didn't he do something about Russian meddling? And what about those in charge who are now sure that the Russian plot worked, but they sounded very different back then? James Clapper was the director of national intelligence from 2010 to 2017. Charged with bringing together all of the input from all the intel agencies that are under his watch. He was the guy supposed to bring it all together and assess what's going on. Remember, his post was created after 9/11 because of a tragic lack of dot connecting in the run-up to the attack. So how did he do? Connecting the dots, which was his job. Compare what Clapper said in the summer before the 2016 election, when Clinton and Trump were still out there campaigning and the outcome was still months away, with what he's saying now.
Was this just to stir up trouble, or was this ultimately to try to influence an election? And we don't know enough to describe motivation.
I don't think there's any question about clearly the Russians were trying to affect the election.
Clapper's latest comments were in reaction to a series of very interesting tweets over the weekend from Facebook's Rob Goldman, who says this, and you know Facebook was used for a lot of the input here from the Russians, according to what we learned. He said, I've seen all the Russian ads, and I can say very definitively that swaying the election was not the main goal. The majority of the Russian ad spend happened after the election. Trace Gallagher, following this story live for us from our Los Angeles bureau tonight, has more. Good evening, Trace.
Good evening, Martha. President Trump's rapid-fire burst of more than a dozen tweets this holiday weekend mostly went after the usual targets, those he believes are carrying out a witch hunt against him, like CNN, the Democratic Party, and former President Obama. But the president also offered a few surprises by applauding an adversary and admonishing an ally. For example, when the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, was pressed on something that President Trump has been saying for more than a year, the fact that Russian meddling began midway through President Obama's second term, Schiff said this on CNN. Watch.
I've said all along that I thought the Obama administration should have done more. And indeed, when we discovered and we could attribute the conduct to Russia, Senator Feinstein and I took the first steps to make public attribution, because at that time we couldn't get the Obama administration to acknowledge the Russian interference.
Schiff went on to say Trump is making the same mistake Obama made in not countering Russian disinformation. But in response to Schiff going after the previous administration, Mr. Trump tweeted, quoting, finally, little Adam Schiff, the leaking monster of no control, is now blaming the Obama administration for Russian meddling in the 2016 election. He is finally right about something. Obama was president, knew of the threat, and did nothing. Thank you, Adam. But when National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster said that Robert Mueller's indictment of more than a dozen Russians accused of meddling means that Russian interference is now, quote, beyond dispute, President Trump fired off this tweet, quote, General McMaster forgot to say that the results of the 2016 election were not impacted or changed by the Russians, and that the only collusion was between Russia and Crooked Hillary, the Democratic National Committee, and the Dems. Conservatives are now counseling President Trump not to claim that Mueller's Russian indictments vindicate his campaign, because it's unclear if Mueller will issue more indictments down the road. Though conservatives also want to know why, when President Obama was warned about Russian interference in 2014, his administration apparently disregarded the warning. Martha.
Trace, thank you very much. So joining me now, Tammy Bruce, columnist at the Washington Times and a Fox News contributor, and Philippe Reines, a former advisor to Hillary Clinton. Philippe, let me start with you. You hear the argument laid out that under President Obama's watch, all of this was going on. At the time, the comments that we got from the top brass and intel were that it really wasn't that big a deal. In fact, even when President Trump, candidate Trump at the time, suggested that, there might be some sort of fraud, there might be, reasons to doubt the election, President Obama came out full bore and said, absolutely not. Nobody can mess with the American election. But the tune changed dramatically after the outcome of the election.
Well, I mean, on the theme of the NBA All-Star Game, I think what Donald Trump did very well in 2016, 2015 is work the refs. I don't think the issue was what the Obama administration did about the intelligence. It's about what they said about it. They, in May 2016, Clapper, knowing what he knew at that time, said that they were targeting the campaign. In July is when the DNC was hacked. And if you remember, Donald Trump's first instinct was to say the DNC hacked itself. It wasn't until September that the entire intelligence community came together and said that they unanimously believe it was Russia and that they had intelligence that Putin himself did it. The next time that Obama saw Putin, he told him to drop it, to stop. Now, playing politics was not saying anything, because they were so worried about what Donald Trump would say about the legitimacy of the election, because if you remember, he was questioning it a great deal, that they, the White House, only wanted to speak publicly if they had Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell with them. Paul Ryan agreed and Mitch McConnell refused. He said, if you do this, I am going to say you were doing it just to hurt Donald Trump.
Yeah, but you know what they said in public and what they should have been doing behind the scenes are two very different things, Tammy. I mean, they clearly did not have their hair on fire, as the famous expression goes, in terms of what we would like to see from an intelligence agency if indeed all this is going on. They said it wasn't a big deal. Now they say it really is.
Yeah, I think that if that's the case when it comes to President Obama and McConnell and Ryan, it's the only time where President Obama didn't just need his phone and his pen. But he did more than just stay silent. In October, he was at a press conference and was asked about this. He actually told Donald Trump to stop whining, said that no serious person would consider this an even remote possibility that that anyone could affect the American elections because they're so dispersed. So he wasn't just quiet. He didn't just not say something. He mocked and chastised people who were warning about it. And it started actually back in 2012 when he mocked Mitt Romney for saying exactly the same thing. So these are interesting questions. I think that politically, of course, when it comes to the arguments that are now being made against the president, these are important and valid things to point out when it comes to what President Obama, up until the election when they thought Hillary was going to be winning, they didn't want a cloud over the election at that point. Only until late December, when it was done, did President Obama get a fire under his chair in order to do something. And that was, as we now know, to set all of this dynamic forward.
Well,
Martha,
after the election. If I could add two things. I'd say one, in October 2016, what President Obama said out loud was that he did not fear the voting systems being hacked because our voting systems, which we've learned since 2000, are terrible. And for someone to hack all of them would be near impossible. He was not talking about their attempts to undermine our election.
Why wouldn't he have said at that point, Philippe? You know, but we are concerned about Russian meddling because we saw what happened this summer with the DNC, and we're very worried about it. There was like a hush-hush feeling because, you know, everybody thought that Hillary was going to win, who obviously was the candidate he wanted to win, and everybody was just sort of like, let's just sit on this whole thing and wait, you know, wait till it goes away.
I think that they had Donald Trump in their head. Honestly, they didn't want him to say, you're right, they thought she would win. They didn't want him to say that the Obama administration tipped the scale by saying don't vote for him. Because remember, if they had said something, people would have thought the Russians are making you vote. And he would have said that that's not fair. But, Martha, to be honest with you,
isn't that interesting in and of itself, though, Philip?
I wish President Obama had said more.
But
I wish he had done more.
But I think that's part of the problem, is that you're saying that Barack Obama was controlled by the fear of what either the Russians would have made possible, or the Russians what would have said, or what Donald Trump maybe would have said, and not willing to deal with the serious.
By Donald Trump.
And as Philippe just said, just one second, because I want to get one more thought in here. Let's put up the money. It's minuscule, the money that the Russians spent on this whole thing. You know, one of the other takeaways, I think, as all of it sunk in over the weekend, was that it doesn't look like a terribly big deal. I mean, $1 million compared to a $2 billion election. How much influence, when you look at all the other influences that were out there on this election, Philippe, doesn't it seem like a bit of a stretch to say that this was the factor that made Hillary lose?
No, I don't think so. First of all, it's one of the factors. I would go back to Jim Comey, but without going down that rabbit hole, I would say that what it did was, you know, spending over $1 million a month on a campaign, that's more than probably Rick Perry did. I mean, they were more effective than most of the Republican field, which I think should be very unnerving, and we should also ask whether they had Western help. But, you know, your audience is aware of certain things, whether it's so-called Pizzagate or Seth Rich. Those things came from the Podesta email. the hack of the Podesta email was basically free advertising for all these negative things. And by the way, if the Russians spend even $1 on screwing around with us, it's $1 we should not tolerate.
Well, the president said they're laughing their asses off because the money that they put into this whole thing, they got it back a million times over in terms of sowing discord.
If I could add that what really made that $1 million, not a month, $1.2 million for the entire campaign overall, is the fact that the Democrats, the media, and liberals rode on those coattails, moved this notion of that the election was not valid, the divisions between Americans, Michael Moore, the March on Washington, this is not my president, this is a fraud, the attempts to nullify done by actors here, legitimate American actors here, using that kind of rhetoric is what the president was alluding to in his tweet about if they wanted chaos, they succeeded based on what Americans were doing in the midst of this as well.
What Mueller said on Friday was that the Russians paid for a pro-Trump protest or pro-Trump rally the same day that they paid for an anti-Trump rally in the same city.
That's right.
That is the things you're saying. Or
it's the chaos. It's the chaos.
They wanted to sow chaos, which we certainly got. They got it in spades, and we're still in it. Yeah. Thanks, you guys. I'm sorry. I got to leave it there. But you're both great, and we'll have you back soon. Thank you very much. So coming up tonight, the future of the FBI and its director, Christopher Wray, is a very big question tonight. Are politics trumping what the president calls the basics at the Bureau? Former FBI Assistant Director Ron Hosko joins me next.
The FBI is engaged in a bunch of stuff that's time wasting, and it isn't going to take us anywhere. Maybe the FBI should stop trying to find every case of sexual harassment in the White House, and maybe they ought to give up on this ridiculous pursuit the Russians colluded with Trump on the election. But clearly, this is my point. A lot of people knew. A lot of people had every bit of knowledge they knew to act on this guy, to surveil this guy. You know, we're told, well, we can't do anything until the crime's been committed. That's what has to change.
The accused Florida school shooter with his head down and his eyes on the floor in court for a status hearing just a few short hours ago. He joins a shocking club whose members include the Boston Bombers and the Chelsea Bomber. Each one had brushes and interaction with the FBI and a citizen who did what they were supposed to do and blew the whistle. But they got away and they killed and injured innocent people. So Ron Hosko joins me now, former assistant director of the criminal division of the FBI. He has 3 decades of experience working for the agency that he dedicated so much of his life to. Ron, it's good to have you here tonight. Thank you very much for being with us. To that charge, and the president made a similar claim that there's too much focus on Russia and some of these other things and not enough on the basics at the FBI, and that the agency has become politicized. What do you say?
You know, Martha, the FBI agent workforce is somewhere between, I think, 12 and 13,000 people. That's roughly a third the size of the New York Police Department. What does the FBI have to cover with those numbers of agents? International investigations that include counterterrorism, counterespionage, thousands right there, cyber and criminal cases ranging from public corruption to gangs to violent crime to white-collar crime and fraud. And they have to do that on a global scale. So that's a lot to do. And I understand the political rhetoric that's going on, and a lot of it directed at the FBI right now. But we're talking about very few resources compared to the size of the agent workforce that are devoted to support Bob Mueller right now, that were devoted to support the Hillary Clinton investigation. I don't think that politics is dominating what the FBI does. I think it's a very, very small part of what they have to do.
I understood, and well taken, your points. But when people listen to what happened here, they say, how can a school expel someone, right? His name is in some sort of public database for the school system, I'm sure. This kid has been expelled. Then you've got the FBI. You've got someone who clearly reaches out, says he has a gun, he has motive, and we know from the previous time that the FBI was contacted that he wanted to be a school shooter. Why is there not an alarm bell that goes off, that those databases talk to each other and they say, wow, you know what, we need to go check this out? Or if the FBI is too much on their plate, call the local law enforcement and say, we put all this together. You guys need to do this because this can't happen, obviously. And I'm sure it kills you that this happened.
Yeah, well, it does. I mean, this hurts all of us, current people working for the FBI and those of us who have spent our careers there. It is a catastrophic tragedy, period. It may be a people failure, it may be a technology failure, it may be both. But to your second point, I think that would be the path. First, the FBI has no jurisdiction in investigating, proposed or would-be school shooters. They do have some narrow jurisdiction to support the local law enforcement response in an active shooter situation. So the option in my mind would be having this clear, convincing evidence from somebody close to Cruz. They should have packaged that up. It should have gone to Miami, the Miami office, and it should have been delivered to state and local law enforcement having jurisdiction over that school. The systems failed that community, failed this school, and in ways failed this child, Cruz. He's an adult now. Probably failed them all along. We've heard reports of DCFS having multiple visits and having the wrong assessment. Police being out there dozens of times, perhaps having the wrong assessments.
But let me ask you something, Ron, before I let you go. How often does this happen, that these many wires are tripped? So is this the sort of thing, as an FBI person, you say, oh, we get those kind of messages every day? Or is a message like this that is, a credible assessment of somebody who they know well? Does that happen a lot, what we saw here?
Tips from the community do trigger new investigations, whether it's criminal, particularly terror, cyber investigations. That happens all the time. Here, this was an FBI failure, and the director's going to have to account for it.
Do you think the director should go?
No, I don't. If this was
should the person who was supposed to pass this along to local law enforcement go?
I think the failure was in West Virginia at the tip line. We don't know what the details are yet, and I think if it's a people failure, then Christopher Wray needs to take the right personnel action. That may be one person fired, maybe multiple people fired. Got to find facts first.
Ron Hosko, always good to have you, sir. Thank you very much. So the shortcomings at the FBI that we just discussed begs the question, does the change that we need to see begin at home? Does it begin in church? The NFL's Benjamin Watson with a very powerful message for all of us, plus Steve Hilton and Dr. Carol Swain on how to change our troubled culture from the bottom up.
I had met him a couple times before. He had spent the night at the house, and he was very polite. He seemed normal.
On this President's Day, when the teenagers of Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, should have been home enjoying a day off, they were attending funerals for their classmates. These images are heart-wrenching, and they have ignited a fierce debate in this country as politicians, the media, and beyond all try to pin the blame on gun control or mental illness. But outspoken NFL player Benjamin Watson has this message for everyone. In a passionate Facebook post, he writes, quote, "While justice demands this young man in Parkland, Florida be held accountable for the heinous plan he carried out by his own volition, we must have the courage to take an honest assessment of our culture in its totality and how it relates to this tragedy and others like it." Baltimore Ravens tight end Benjamin Watson joins me now. Ben, good to see you tonight. Thank you for being here. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by that is that every time there's an instance like this, something really horrific, we talk about respecting life. And while that's very important, we have to look at our culture as a whole. We incarcerate our young men at alarming rates. We vote for things that create the disintegration of the family. We murder 60 million of our unborn since Roe v. Wade. We're a culture that really gravitates toward violence. And so while we must hold this young man accountable, we need to step back and say, hold on, what are we as parents teaching our children? How are we as teachers dealing with kids when they have certain conflict in the classroom? All these things are very important. So it's easy to say that it's one thing or the other, that it's guns or it's a law that needs to be changed. And while that may be the case, on a larger aspect, we need to, as individuals, as parents, as a community, as a culture, identify where we've gone wrong and be willing and have the courage to fix it.
I hear you. One of the things that's so hard fathom in this whole situation. I mean, he was orphaned, then he was adopted, and then he lost both of his parents, I should say. They both died due to illness. And then he was with one family, and then he went to another family. I mean, you know, clearly he had a tremendous amount of tragedy over the course of his life. And these people who were very kind. They took him into their home, and they spoke out this morning about how they feel about all this. Let's watch that.
Everything everybody seems to know, we didn't know. We had rules, and he followed every rule to the T. We knew he had one Instagram account that my son had, and I guess that would be the normal one. These other Instagram accounts that he had, we had no idea about. My son had no idea about. As far as the animal killings, he never did anything like that at our house. We have animals, and he loved our animals loved him.
So given the change that you think we need to see, Ben, you know, when you look at this case, this situation, what cries out to you?
Well, what cries out to me the most is that people are hurting. This young man went through so much in his life, so much tragedies, and people are really hurting. And when you take faith out of the public arena, when you take God out of there, people suffer. And whether you believe you're a Christian or not, those principles really carry us through. I mean, talking to my father, who has seen kind of how things have changed over the course of his lifetime, a lot of people of his generation point to the fact that when we start to remove God from the public sphere, we start to suffer the consequences. And so for me, I look at this young man and I say, you know, there's a lot of people like him that are suffering. How can I reach out to him? How can I share the love and hope of Christ to him? How can I listen to him? A lot of times, because of the culture we're in, we're on our cell phones. We're not paying attention to who's around us. We're unwilling to communicate with others. And so they feel like they're isolated in these silos.
You know, let's put up these numbers, because Pew Research says that 7 out of 10 Americans consider themselves Christian. However, the number has slipped by more than 8% over the course of the last 7 years. So what do you, and you talk about your dad and you know, you speak with him about this, what does he attribute that to?
Well, you know, it's one thing to poll and say these people are Christian. More what I'm talking about is understanding that because of who God is and because of his love for us, we respect all life. And that there's a broad spectrum there. The way you treat people is very, very important. Even if you look at it now, you look at how we go back and forth. We get in our different tribes. We call names. We shout. We scream. We curse at each other over social media. There seems to be such a great divide when it comes to how we communicate with each other. I believe that all of that really is kind of the underlying foundation when we start to see more things like this starting to happen, because people are really frustrated and they don't quite know how to lash out because they're not really looking at each other the way God would see us.
You said, Ben, in your Facebook post, over this week, while we have been driven to our knees, as countless voices invoke prayer, I am haunted by the fact that this very exercise is forbidden in this school and thousands of other schools across the nation. And I ask myself, if he is God in crisis, is he also not God in peace?
Yeah, well, one thing I've always said, whenever we have a natural disaster or a hurricane or an earthquake, something like that, or a school shooting, of which we've had many over the last few months, we always invoke prayer. We say we want to send our thoughts and prayers. We want to pray for these people. And that's very, very, very important. Don't get me wrong. We also need action when it comes to certain laws or whatever that may be. But what I'm saying is that we can't come to God as if he's some sort of cosmic vending machine. Whenever we have a problem, we just reach out to him. No, we need to be submitting to him daily in our lives. We need to be coming to him every day saying, Lord, how can I help people? How can I reach out to people? What are the things I can do for the person that is being maligned? What can I do for the vulnerable so that they don't feel like they have to lash out and do things like this? Lord, give me wisdom when it comes to that. And that comes from a daily walk with him. It's not something that we just turn to when we have a crisis. Now, he will answer us in crisis, and he will come to us and save us and help us in our time of need. But more importantly, when we look at what's happened in our schools by taking prayer out of schools, by taking the 10 Commandments, God, out of schools, by taking him out of the public sphere, by saying that, you know, we're not going to listen to God, we're not going to talk about him, we're simply going to do what we think is best, and then we turn to him in these times, it rings hollow. And so if we can trust God during these times when we are horrified by what happened, when we have nowhere else to turn, why can't we trust him in those times of peace?
Benjamin Watson, wise man. Thank you, sir. Good to see you tonight.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Here now, Steve Hilton, host of The Next Revolution here on Fox News, and Dr. Carol Swain, former professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University. Carol, let me start with you. You say that, that the conversation always goes immediately to gun control and mental health. What do you think about what Ben just had to say in the framework of your thinking on this?
I agree with him 100%. I believe that we need to focus on character building of young people. Young people need to know the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I think too much of what they're learning today in school is about how to be offended. Too much political correctness. Young people are not being taught how to think critically, and they're so easily offended. And all of this stuff about bullying, most of us who have gone to school were teased at some point. We learn to get by. And I think that today we teach our children to look for ways to be offended, and the adults are not providing the moral guidance that they need.
I hear you.
And
I do.
Yes.
I just think of the kids who voices were very clear, and the concern that they had about this young man. And I just can't imagine the frustration that they have. We also have to listen to children when they come to us with these kind of concerns, because they did know, some of them, and they carry that burden with them now. Steve Hilton, you have said that, growing up in England, you looked at what this problem was in the United States, because it is unique, unfortunately, to the U.S., and you see it differently now that you're here.
Yeah, Martha, I think that actually this is the biggest issue that we have to confront in America. Tonight we're talking about it in the terrible circumstances of the Parkland shooting, but another night we could be talking about it in relation to gang violence, and another night it could be domestic violence, and another night it could be drug addiction or welfare dependency. It all goes back to the same thing, which is a social breakdown that's been going on in America, I think, for at least 4, maybe 5 decades now. And at the heart of it is family breakdown, the real trend away from children growing up in stable, loving homes, and the fact that more and more children are growing up in broken homes and in a culture of toxic stress and violence. And that is affecting our society in deeply troubling ways. And it really is something that we can confront, but we've got to really prioritize it as an issue.
Yeah, it's so important. And, you look at Chicago, Dr. Carol Swain, and the numbers of children who are killed all of the time there, and in other places where these kinds of violent outbreaks happen little bits at a time, but the numbers add up to an extraordinary number. And family breakdown is a big part of that environment, is it not?
it is, and you can trace the dysfunction back to the 1960s. In 1962, the Supreme Court removed prayer from school. 1963, Bible reading. And if you look at the indicators of dysfunction, I mean, everything changed dramatically in the 1960s, and I think it can be traced back to those decisions that we've made. And I believe that the way we correct things is to start encouraging young people to value life. In the black community, there's a devaluation of life at every stage. You see it in the abortion rate. You see it in the black on-black violent crime rate. And that's something that we need to turn around. But our entire society devalues life. They're afraid of God. And those who profess to be Christians, there's nothing about their behavior of this society that would suggest that they're truly Christians in the biblical sense.
Steve, final thought.
So there's something practical I think we need to focus on, which is so much of this comes back to the way kids are raised and the way that they are raised by their parents. We can actually help parents to do a better job. You've got generation after generation now who are growing up having experienced really bad parenting, so they don't know how to do it themselves. And we can actually give them practical help to do that. And that is one simple thing that we can do that would make a difference.
Thank you both. Very good to have both of you weigh in on all of this really important topic tonight. We hope the conversation continues from here. Steve and Dr. Carol Swain, many thanks. So coming up, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's rare interview shaking up what we have heard about North Korea. Plus, Oprah versus Trump in 2020. In private, apparently, she has reportedly not ruled out running. Now, President Trump is daring her to do just that. Karl Rove weighs in next.
There have been some members of Congress, including Republicans, questioning his stability and fitness for office.
President Trump practically daring Oprah Winfrey to run against him in 2020 after he caught this exchange on 60 Minutes last night. Watch.
So polls are showing that respect for the United States is eroding around the world. There have been some members of Congress, including Republicans, questioning his stability and fitness for office. During the campaign, we are all aware that some 20 women accused him of inappropriate sexual behavior. Or do you think the president is held to a different standard when it comes to this issue of sexual harassment?
So in response to the questions, primarily and the way they were phrased, President Trump tweeted, "Just watched a very insecure Oprah Winfrey, who at one point I knew very well. She was interviewing a panel of people on 60 Minutes. The questions were biased and slanted, the facts incorrect. Hope Oprah runs so she can be exposed and defeated like all the others." Joining me now, Karl Rove, Fox News contributor and former senior advisor to President George W. Bush, and our resident Oprah expert joining me tonight. Hi, Karl. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So, so the president tweeted a lot over the course of the last couple of days, last 48 hours or so. But this got him fired up when he watched this. He thought it was unfair. What do you think?
Well, first of all, the presidential election is 3 years off. She has said that she may run, she may not run. She said God hadn't talked to her, and she thought that if God wanted her to run, he'd talk to her about it. And I would remind you that even while she's draws overwhelmingly favorable reviews, in the NPR poll, 35% said she should run for president, and 54% said she should not. My point is the president ought to be focused on being president. My opinion is Oprah Winfrey is unlikely to run, and there's plenty of time before the next election, if she does run, for him to voice his opinions. I think the American people want him focused on being president. I don't think it helps his cause or the cause of his agenda for him to be spending his time punching down to somebody who may or may not run and is unlikely to run, in my opinion.
Yeah. I'm curious what you thought about the panel itself and the questions and, the time that 60 Minutes devoted to giving her that platform to do that.
Yeah. Well, look, the panel, they started this a year ago. The panel consists of a small number of people, half of them pro-Trump, half of them not Trump. And they did it a year ago. And so this was, I really have a concern about doing these focus groups. I know we at Fox do them sometimes, but I think there's all kinds of potential problems in having a small group like that and trying to make big judgments about it, particularly a group that you've already exposed to television coverage and then brought them back. Those people are going to be inclined less to give their opinions than to do what they did before, only times 10, and that is perform for the cameras. So it may make for interesting television. I'm not certain it's particularly good journalism.
It does make for interesting television, though.